Daniel McGuire is a prominent Roman Catholic ethicist, and he once said to me, "Gary, if you ever find yourself feeling mildly depressed, just feeling that your life isn't amounting to much of anything, just find a way to get yourself introduced." So, Chris, I have to tell you, it's working for me here. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Although I was lifted far higher by those two magnificent songs that we just heard, I'm grateful for this honor of speaking, of being the Barbara Holmes speaker this year, for the hospitality of Dr. Wood and Dr. Winston. I've got all manner of connections to this community. Pete Getke is a long-time and treasured friend of mine, and Andre Johnson's work on Henry McNeil Turner has been very important to me in a book that just came out a couple of months ago called The New Abolition. Some of you know Al Young, who is now my colleague at Union Theological Seminary. So I have all manner of connections to this place. I greatly admire the service that Barbara Holmes gave to Memphis Theological Seminary and this community. Tomorrow morning at the seminary, I'm going to give a swashbuckling talk that kind of sloshes back and forth between my new book on the origins of the Black social gospel tradition and my forthcoming book on the Black social gospel from the 1930s to the 1970s. That talk will be the opposite of this one. That one is wide-ranging and overflowing with subjects and persons. This one is going to focus on one person, one of my favorites of the entire Black social gospel tradition, Reverend E.C. Ranger. The Black social gospel is wrongly and strangely overlooked. Few books refer to it. There are no books on this tradition as a whole. Well, at least until now. And the phrase registers almost nothing on Google. Yet this is the category that best describes Martin Luther King Jr., his chief mentors, his closest movement allies, and the entire tradition of Black church racial justice activism reaching back to the 1880s. Martin Luther King Jr. did not come from nowhere, and it is not enough to say that he grew up in the Southern Black Baptist Church and then went to seminary. There was a black tradition of the social gospel that gave leaders and ballast to the civil rights movement. The things that defined it made it distinct, controversial, and historic. It built upon affirmations about human dignity and divine justice that most black churches proclaimed, but distinctly. It provided the embattled theology and politics of social justice that the civil rights movement spoke and sang, and it remains a vital perspective. The white social gospel is renowned and heavily chronicled. It arose during the Progressive Era, and it was already a movement by the mid-1880s, with national organizations and a movement agenda linked with progressivism. It had its heyday from 1900 to 1917. It put social justice on the agenda of the ecumenical churches, founding the peace and justice organizations that still operate in Protestant and Catholic churches. It was championed by such extraordinary figures as Washington Gladden, Graham Taylor, George Herron, Jane Addams, Harry Ward, Vita Scudder, John Ryan, Francis McConnell, and the great Walter Rauschenbusch. Yes. By the 1930s, it was mostly a peace and ecumenical movement. But the greatest legacy of the social gospel is not the one recounted in books about Rauschenbusch, Gladden, the Federal Council of Churches, and all that. For the black social gospel is far more significant than the famous white one. Yeah. All right. It had its own identity and integrity, while sharing important things with white progressive Christianity, most notably the abolitionist tradition. The black social gospel grew out of the abolitionist tradition, but it responded to new challenges and a new era of American history, the abandonment of Reconstruction, the evisceration of constitutional rights, an upsurge of racial lynching and Jim Crow abuse, struggles for mere survival in every part of the nation, and the excruciating question of what a new abolition would require. The leading figures of this tradition in my first volume are William Simmons, Henry McNeil Turner, Alexander Crummell, Booker T. Washington, Ida Wells Barnett, Reverdy Ransom, Alexander Walters, Nanny Burroughs, George Woodbey, Adam Clayton Powell Sr., and Richard Wright Jr., plus W.E.B. Du Bois, who is a special case. My second volume will focus on Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, Howard Thurman, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Pauli Murray, and Martin Luther King Jr., plus many activists in the SCLC and SNCC, including Diane Nash and James Lawson. The famous people alone in this list make the black social gospel the most important religious tradition in American history, period. But many of the people that I've just named are completely forgotten, because the black social gospel has not received its due recognition as a tradition of religious thought and activism. For example, consider Reverend C. Ransom. He was born in 1861 in Flushing, Ohio, the only child of a powerful, loving woman, Harriet Ransom, who told him he was let down from the skies. Ransom had red hair, and he never knew anything of his father. His mother named him after two politicians and her subsequent husband, George Ransom. In 1865, she went to work as a domestic servant in Washington, Ohio. At night, they slept in the unheated attic of one of the houses in which she worked. Ransom dreaded the cold attic and the places where his mother left him during the day. Ohio was hostile terrain for African Americans, yet they migrated there anyway, coping with resentment, abuse, and lynchings. The Ransoms were active members of the AME Church, which organized in Ohio in the 1820s, and surged with the migration of blacks into Ohio after the Civil War. Harriet worked in the homes of educated pro-slavery Northern Democrats, and she told her son that education was the golden key to a better life, no question about it. The only way for him to not end up poor like her was to aim for Wilberforce University. Even with a determined mother, Ransom was a long shot to make it to college. His segregated black school had one teacher, a white man who taught all the classes. He heard the same dismal lessons year after year. Since he couldn't get an education at school, his mother did laundry jobs for white people in exchange for tutoring. In 1881, she mortgaged her house and sold the family cow to enroll her son down the road at Wilberforce. She also raised his newborn son, as Ransom had impulsively gotten married and had a child. Years later, he shuddered at the memory of nearly breaking his mother's heart. But Harriet Ransom was a force of nature whose son was going to be educated no matter what. Wilberforce was founded in 1856 by the Methodist Episcopal Church. It was originally located in Xenia, Ohio, a community settled in the 1840s by fugitive slaves, free blacks, and the racially mixed families of southern slaveholders. Its original constituency was the planter class that needed a university for its mixed-race children. The school closed in 1862 as a casualty of the Civil War, and the following year, Bishop Daniel Payne bought the university for $10,000 and refounded it as an AME institution. Bishop Payne was the AME Church's dominant figure and the epitome of an Afro-Saxon. He shaped Wilberforce firmly in his image. Wilberforce was a praying school, above all, that stressed learning, service to one's nation and race, and above all, godly living. Compulsory chapel services were held twice per day. Payne was intense, rigidly disciplined, scholarly, and theologically very conservative. He inveighed against emotionalism, folk religion, the spirituals, which he called cornfield ditties, and disrespect for church law. He took a very stringent view of episcopal authority, especially his own, and his favorite theologian was Charles Hodge of Princeton Theological Seminary, who once boasted that no new thought had been taught at Princeton in his 50 years there. But unlike his favorite theologian, Paine insisted that slavery and racial prejudice had to be anti-Christian. Paine insisted after the Civil War, the AME Church grew dramatically in the South, which brought Southern folk religion into the denomination, which Paine resisted mightily. Ransom trained for the ministry at Wilberforce, completing college and seminary, where he navigated two delicate problems. One was his troubled marriage, which ended shortly after he graduated. The other problem was that he adopted modern views about biblical criticism, evolution, and theology, all of which were anathema at Wilberforce. Ransom had a guilty conscience about pretending to be theologically conservative, but he reasoned that the church needed modern people in the ministry, and there was no other way to get them into the ministry. In 1886, his graduating class consisted of 8 men and 1 woman. Harriet Ransom, sobbing with joy, forced her way onto the stage to embrace her son, causing a spectacle. For the rest of his life, Ransom said that he and his mother graduated together. In his early ministry, he had to play a careful hand, fearing that Paine would get rid of him if he revealed his views. For Paine, the cause of keeping African Methodism impeccably orthodox was a consuming passion. In 1880, the AME Church selected 2 Southern bishops, Richard Kane and Henry McNeil Turner, and in the early 1880s, the Southern churches founded 5 new AME schools. Paine railed against all of it, protesting that the church needed a strong Wilberforce, not a bunch of mediocre schools. Ransom's first church had 13 members, most of them elderly. His second church had 7 members, 5 of them elderly widows. His third church was a mission church in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, consisting of 5 members. He begged Paine for a better assignment, who told him to stop whining. Ransom made pastoral visits with his new wife, Emma Connor, finding hundreds of people in miserable alley tenements and in shanty boats along the riverfront. For the rest of his life, he bitterly criticized the AME custom of assigning young pastors to the most impossible posts. Finally, in 1890, Paine rewarded Ransom with a parish in Springfield, Ohio, which he served for 3 years before moving to a big steeple church in Cleveland, St. John Church. There, he developed his signature theme of his early ministry, that the USA was the greatest nation in the world and the symbol of modern progress, with one terrible exception and one significant caveat. The exception was racism, and the caveat concerned economic justice. Ransom caught the social gospel on the way up. He embraced economic democracy, social democratic politics, and even manifest destiny in terms of cultural progress. In the early going, he simply wanted Black Americans to be counted in it and to be partners in the fulfillment of progress. He boasted that the U.S. led the world in science, intervention, manufacture, statecraft, art, religion, literature. But the mark of true progress was spiritual renewal. Ransom stressed that Black Americans profoundly appreciated the church, school, home, pillars of high civilization. Wherever they moved, they built churches. Despite being deprived of education, they made greater efforts to become literate than any people in history. Despite having their families ripped apart by slavery, they built new families as circles of virtue. All of this counted in the tally of American progress, he preached. Yet white America savagely terrorized blacks amid all this progress. Ransom implored that somehow the the USA got more civilized and more barbaric at the same time. Northern newspapers reported lynchings and burnings with rarely a word of criticism. Southern newspapers rationalized racist murder by depicting African Americans as too dangerous and inhuman to be dealt with by mere law. The lynchers were saviors of civilization. Ransom urged his congregation not to lose hope or to indulge the fantasy of returning to Africa. African Americans were Americans, and their progress was the key to America's brilliant future. On racial caste, racial pride, and racial militancy, Ransom preceded W.E.B. Du Bois by 10 years. He preached that personal salvation and social salvation went together, and that racism was linked to a predatory economic system. In the pulpit, he despaired of fathers and mothers that gambled and drank. He railed against mothers that dispatched their children to buy alcohol for them, a sore subject for him. Ransom adored his mother, but he was describing his own experience and alluding to his personal struggle with alcoholism. Though he blasted the sins of indulgence in his weekday life, he was known for treating people gently, without moral censure. In Cleveland, he came out as a democratic socialist, which put him on a novel path. Payne avoided politics and social activism, but Bishop Benjamin Arnett was deeply involved in Republican Party politics. Arnett served one term in the Ohio legislature. He cultivated close ties with Ohio Governor William McKinley, and he became a close friend and protector to Ransom. For Arnett, political ministry was about winning patronage and building a political machine. Ransom took no interest whatsoever in that. For him, the social gospel compelled the church to struggle for social justice, which meant campaigning against lynching and racism, and for progressive politics and economic justice. In 1896, Arnett sent Ransom to Bethel Church in Chicago, where Ida Wells Arnett was a member. Ransom attracted overflow crowds at Bethel Church, where he welcomed the migration of Southern blacks to Chicago. He joined a new organization led by Alexander Walters and Thomas Fortune, the Afro-American Council, which grew out of the old Afro-American League. The League had begun as a militant racial justice group organized by Fortune, but it floundered. The council was a second try, but now Booker T. Washington was wildly famous. He was very much opposed to protest activism, and he had a new friend, a backsliding Thomas Fortune, who was depressed from the failure of the Afro-American League. If Walters was determined to build a protest organization, then Booker T. had to take it over. Ransom and Wells Barnett tried to prevent Booker T. from subverting the council. In 1899, Ransom made his first national splash by denouncing Booker T. as a counterfeit leader who sold out black Americans. The response was blistering and incredulous. Editorialists across the country condemned Ransom for denigrating what they invariably called the Moses of black America. Du Bois joined the chorus, publicly admonishing Ransom, calling him out. In 1899, Du Bois was still a trimmer, groping for a third way between Booker accommodation and protest militancy. It took another 5 years for Du Bois to catch up to Ransom as a protest militant, and it took him longer for economic justice. In Chicago, Ransom befriended white social gospel leaders Graham Taylor and Jane Addams, super lawyer Clarence Darrow, and black civic leader S. Lang Williams, a wealthy Bookerite. He read every book that George Herron wrote during Herron's heyday, absorbing Herron's radical Christian socialism. Ransom judged that democratic socialism was the sign and goal of the coming solidarity of the human race. Admittedly, it had little following among African Americans, but that would change as soon as African Americans took account of the big picture. Ransom reasoned that black Americans were too hard-pressed by poverty, denigration, oppression, ignorance, and violence to see beyond these struggles for survival. They had little occasion to reflect on structural issues, and the class struggle was just too depressing to think about anyway, because most of the labor movement was just implacably racist. For Ransom, there was no substitute for abolishing racial exclusion in the labor movement, because the class struggle was terribly real and unavoidable. Being a progressive helped him cope with his despair, because progressivism was about making progress, washing away various forms of tyranny. Ransom was wholeheartedly for American progress and even American exceptionalism, as long as black Americans were included in it. He boasted that the USA was the world's greatest nation and American Christians were the world's highest type of human being. They had the biggest brains and hearts in the world, the most productive economy, and the strongest civilization. If only white America would face up to the evil of its racism and complete the modern revolution by socializing the economy, the U.S. would be a model for all nations.
Yes. Yes.
When the USA went to war with Spain in 1898, Ransom recruited a full regiment of black soldiers and officers at his own expense, using Bethel Church as a sleeping quarter for volunteers. He spoke for the city of Chicago at a huge celebration after the soldiers returned from the war. George Herron condemned the war as an imperialist conceit and a betrayal of the American Republic. Ransom countered that it was a good thing for the U.S. to acquire global ambitions. He stood squarely, back then, with the faction of the social gospel that wanted to Christianize imperialism. The U.S. invaded only to liberate. Christianity was a missionary faith, and the goal of good Christianity, socialism, and Americanism was to achieve human solidarity and liberation. In 1900, he asked Jane Addams what it would take to found a settlement house in his neighborhood. She said it would take a lot of money. Adams helped Ransom raise the money for a pioneering settlement featuring a nursery and kindergarten, employment training and counseling, discussion groups, and lectures. He preached that the gospel compelled churches to lift up the poor and vulnerable and to welcome the migrant strangers pouring in from the South. His clerical colleagues vehemently disagreed on every count, charging that Ransom replaced evangelism with social work. He copied the white social gospelers, and he embarrassed them by criticizing Booker T. Washington. The more renowned that Ransom became, the worse things got for him at home. His colleagues resented his growing fame and the fact that his radicalism threatened to get them in trouble with white people. They convinced the AME's new presiding bishop to transfer Ransom to the Indiana Conference. Ransom, hearing of his imminent departure, appealed to Arnett, who had become presiding bishop in New England. Ransom ended up in New England, where his first assignment was in New Bedford, Massachusetts. For him, a culture shock. Ransom was accustomed to large crowds, noise, and strenuous activities. In New Bedford, all was small and tranquil. He later recalled, quote, "Here I found the atmosphere and the people so quaint, so subdued, so unlike the forms of community I had known. I felt I was a disembodied spirit getting acquainted with the modes of life in the spirit world. It astonished him to meet black Americans who were bland and colorless. Their worship was cold and formal. They had no spontaneity, and they took pride in being that way. These people were bred and born Afro-Saxons, although Ransom acknowledged that many of them were also very kindly. He made some friends, but was relieved when Arnett found a better fit for him in Boston, at Charles Street A&E Church. That year, 1905, Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter founded the Niagara Movement, a third attempt at founding a blacks-only racial justice organization. The following year, the group convened at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, a place of overflowing historical resonance, where Ransom gave the keynote speech. Ransom declared that a person like John Brown appeared only once or twice in 1,000 years. John Brown towered above all others, a singular man of action who belonged to no party or school. The abolitionists had spellbinding speakers like Henry Ward Beecher, Wendell Phillips, and Frederick Douglass, but Brown felt called by God to become a traitor to his government in order that he might be true to the slave. Brown tried to spark the slaves to rise up and strike for their freedom. He spurned the slow trickle of the Underground Railroad, setting fire to the slave system. That was still what was needed, he said, for the Civil War had never really ended in this country. African Americans were still in chains. 1906 was way too much like 1859, he said. Black Americans had no rights through most of the South. President Roosevelt ignored the 15th Amendment, and his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, dismissed Afro-Americans as children. Ransom allowed that Black Americans still had a childlike faith in the Republican Party, but that was mercifully ending. The soul of John Brown marched in the resistance of the Niagara movement. Ransom contended that Black Americans who stood up for their rights were the true patriots, calling the USA to its own best meaning. He had a vision of Black and white Americans going forth to teach the world how to build democratic, interracial Christian societies. He stressed that if Black Americans got their rights in the U.S., they would be in a position to play a redemptive role in the world by virtue of being Americans. The only blacks in the world who had a chance of playing that kind of role at the global level were Black Americans. This vision of international and social transformation flew on the wings of the social gospel belief in cultural progress and universal democracy. Ransom's address at Harper's Ferry was so spellbinding that Du Bois gave his speech to someone else, William Hershaw, to read, so he wouldn't have to suffer from performance comparisons. For many years, this was Ransom's main theme. But these were the very years in which racial terrorism became a national epidemic. In the 1880s, it was still possible for northern white liberals in certain venues to speak for racial justice without triggering a backlash. Then came the eruption of white nationalist rage, the plague of disenfranchisement, and Plessy versus Ferguson, and by 1910, there was no tolerance in polite society for racial justice activism of any kind. White liberals cowered in silence, just like the Black ministers that accused Ransom of endangering them. The NAACP was founded in 1910 precisely as a response to this situation, merging the descendants of the Black abolitionist and white abolitionist movements. Ransom was always willing to join. Is this still on? Ransom was always willing to join any group that tried to make a difference, so he joined the NAACP. But the white liberals and Black moderates who ran the governing board had trouble enough coping with Du Bois, so they kept Ransom off the board. For a while, Ransom seemed to find a home in Boston, a city that took pride in its abolitionist legacy. He studied the local abolitionist tradition, and he filled his sermons with references to it. At a conference honoring William Lloyd Garrison, Ransom gave a scintillating speech that won nationwide press coverage. The Boston Herald reported, quote, "The applause was simply tremendous, frequently compelling the speaker to pause for several minutes. At its close, the scene was indescribable. Women wept, men embraced each other. Guests rushed upon the orator with congratulations, the program was forgotten, and only the playing of the band restored order and made it possible to proceed. Julia Ward Howe, composer of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, gushed over Ransom on the stage, which got a lot of newspaper play, but the A&E pastors in New England were very much like the A&E pastors in Chicago. They did not like Ransom, or his theology, or especially his politics. They pressed so hard to get rid of him that even Henry McNeill Turner, Arnett's successor in Boston, and usually the epitome of a bullish militant, caved into their demands. Ransom had to go. So Turner moved him to Bethel Church in New York on West 25th Street, which Ransom accepted with a heavy heart. He said, well, at least this time I'm too big to be shuffled off to Indiana. In New York, he cut a deal with Tammany Hall that ended the city's prohibition on black police officers. He became a player in the Federal Council of Churches, representing the AME Church on the Council's executive committee. He treasured the ecumenical movement, which he described as American Christianity at its best. He pressed the Council to take risks for racial justice, and he wrote the first draft of what statements the Council did make. But he seethed that nothing changed in the churches at the ground level. In 1912, the Taft administration invaded Cuba, which gave Ransom second thoughts about Manifest Destiny. On the eve of the Republican National Convention, Ransom observed that the U.S. was not the only place where blacks suffered under vicious racism. Wherever the white man roamed, he proclaimed his lordship over darker-colored people. Now the Marines were doing it in Cuba. Ransom declared that he opposed any American intervention in Cuba that, quote, set up a white man's government. If this government by its might crushes the present revolt of the blacks of Cuba against injustice, it may by its intervention proclaim peace, but it will be the peace of despotism and everlasting disgrace, unquote. Ransom was finished with enlisting black Americans to put down people of color in foreign lands. He had urged black soldiers to risk being court-martialed and imprisoned instead of killing brown insurgents in the Philippines and blacks in Cuba. In 1912, he made a career move that enhanced his independence and influence, winning election as editor of the AME Church Review. It gave him an independent base as a general officer of the denomination, and it gave him 12 years of access to a national church audience. Ransom featured black American scholarship, he espoused the social gospel, and reported on trends in theology, ethics, culture, science, and the arts. This was the same period in which Du Bois founded Crisis magazine and had a spectacular run. Ransom and Du Bois formed a tag team, conferring about topics and offering a combined subscription to their magazines. Both aimed directly at the educated elite, and both weathered constant complaints that they were too radical for the positions they held. Ransom and Du Bois held similar views about almost everything, especially in what Ransom called the pride of race. Pride motivates human beings to adventure, to risk, to endure, to triumph, he argued. There is a pride of race that lifts human beings to greatness, and a pride that breeds intolerance and contempt. Whenever the latter type prevails, it produces shrunken souls. The ideal is a pride of personality that transcends race, which is grounded in the recognition of the divine life in every human soul. Ransom worked both sides of Du Boisian double consciousness long after Du Bois himself stopped talking about his conflicted blackness and Americanism. To Ransom, the situation for black Americans was terrible and desperate, yet it was also distinctly promising. On the one hand, white America yielded nothing through sympathy or love, even to its own poor. It yielded not to the message of its religion. It yielded only to determined power. Ransom preached the necessity of gaining black power for redemptive ends. On the other hand, by virtue of being Americans, black Americans had advantages over all other blacks on the planet. They had more education and wealth than blacks anywhere else, and at least potentially, they had access to U.S. American power. He put it plainly, and forcefully. The USA had what the world needed, but its saving power was diminished by white America's abuse of black Americans, who stood for Americanism at its best. The more power and well-being that black Americans gained, the more the U.S. became the best version of itself. A sermon that Martin Luther King gave more than once. Black Americans, besides being the truest Americans, were the true Christians in the USA. Ransom, Howell Sr., and Nanny Burroughs gave that sermon repeatedly throughout the 1920s. This message won a large following for Ransom in the AME Church, which carried him to a bishop's chair. Running a quarterly magazine was not enough for him, so he launched a mission church in New York's Tenderloin district that ministered to what he called the bad Negroes, the Negroes of his homes. Ransom was double-minded about this subject too. On the one hand, he regretted that his denomination was too middle class, and thus removed from the urban poor. On the other hand, he was grateful to be middle class, and he did not romanticize the poor. Quote, "These cannot rise without their aid, but the more neglected will tend to drag the upper stratum of the race down to the depth where they lie." Unquote. Somehow, he urged, quote, "These two extremes must be brought together until each stands uplifted under the inspiration of a quickening touch, girded with new spiritual power and strength, and animated with unity of purpose." Unquote. At first, his mission church was fiercely resented by AME clergy, who charged that Ransom was on another ego trip. One power base was not enough for him, and he was sure to steal members from them. Ransom and his wife, Emma, took all of that in stride. They rented an apartment on West 36th Street. They toured the saloons, gambling joints, and prostitution houses, and befriended people wherever they went, with no words about religion. Gradually, many of their neighbors found their way to Ransom's church. In 1924, he was elected the 48th bishop of the AME Church. Ransom did not want to be a bishop, but the church now had enough social gospel progressives to elect one as bishop, so he gave in. He feared that the work would consume him, which is what happened. He supervised large AME conferences that sprawled over several states. He tried to merge the three black Methodist denominations, but failed, having played a key role in thwarting an earlier merger, and he founded the Fraternal Council of Negro Churches, which also failed. For him, the tasks of just keeping the institution going were grinding and emotionally draining. In his last years, the nationalist strain in his thought grew stronger. It amazed him that white Americans mustered ample sympathy for persecuted Irish, Jews, and Armenians, but for black Americans, they had only fearful loathing. Why? He would ask, constantly, why? Black Americans had never been anything but loyal Americans and faithful Christians. But what did it get them? He went to church. They got an education. They learned to trade, and they were still brutalized. Quote, "Their disillusionment is almost complete, since they find that Christ has not been able to break the American color line. If Jesus wept over Jerusalem, he should have, for America, an ocean of tears." In the 1930s, Ransom's social gospel comrade, Richard Wright Jr., campaigned hard for FDR in the New Deal. And Ransom took a bit of consolation that the New Deal was built with socialist planks. But the 1930s were so terrible for African Americans that Ransom struggled to muster inspiring oratory. He found only one thing to truly celebrate: that black Americans acquired a stronger racial identity and self-respect. Ransom's version of black theology, coupled a forceful affirmation of black consciousness with a straightforward belief in the superiority of Christianity. These two things had to go together, he would say. Otherwise, Christianity would not be saving for African Americans. Christianity was the absolute religion. In 1933, he said it plainly to a conference on world religions. Quote, "The avowed objective of Christianity is to supersede all other religious faiths and become the one and dominant kingdom of God from sea to sea. There is neither accommodation nor compromise. Christ must be exalted over all and above all. Christ offers a way of salvation and life. Take it or leave it. It is new wine and cannot be contained in old wineskins." Unquote. If Christ was not the way, the truth, and the life, he could not be the hope of the oppressed people. Ransom held fast to the teaching, cross, resurrection, and especially kingdom of Christ, while letting go of the USA as the site of the coming kingdom. It was hard to prophesy any longer about black and white America saving the world together when white America was just so determined to cling to its racist supremacism. It seemed to Ransom that white America had lost its soul. In his later career, he taught that Asia, Europe, and the USA were heading downward, while the future belonged to the children of Africa. The Euro-American and Asian civilizations had no compelling spiritual vision for humanity. They stood for wealth, power, weapons, science, technology, and philosophy, all of which had failed or were failing. The white world had never created a great religion, and its substitutes were spiritually barren. The hope of the world was in the very last place that white Americans thought to look. Quote, "The African and his descendants are the last spiritual reserves of the human race." Unquote. Sometimes he put it in world historical terms. The pyramids, the Pantheon, and Colosseum were the tombstones of Egypt, Greece, and Rome, marking the spots where civilizations just destroyed themselves in celebrations of materialistic supremacy and power. Similarly, the colonizing white empires of modern times facilitated the ascendancy of the black race. The later Ransom buttressed this line of argument with some racialist superstitions of his own, claiming that races were genetically endowed with particular traits. Blacks were not suited for math, logic, or science, according to Ransom, but they were naturally gifted at music, speaking, feeling, and spirituality. The black imagination was primarily literary, artistic, and spiritual, looking to the future, not controlling or grasping. Well, that was an echo of the racial romanticism that Ransom shared with Du Bois in the 1890s. Du Bois kept returning to this issue and struggling with it, but Ransom did not keep up with scientific debates about race. His world got smaller, and the sheer torment of coping with a racist society just wore him down. He could still give a strong speech or sermon, but his days of enthralling racially mixed audiences with scintillating oratory were past. His later audiences were church and civic groups, not surging crowds of activists. He felt the difference. In 1936, he told the AMB General Conference, quote, "The world has little interest in us, are concerned about what we do and what we say. To them, we're just a group of Negroes voting on matters that concern our little church." Unquote. That was not the life he had sought. Ransom's sense of shrinking was a harbinger of his fate, because long before he died in 1959, he was totally forgotten. Du Bois declared of Ransom, quote, "He has erected a monument in the history of African Methodism, America, and the world, which shall last through time and eternity." Unquote. On the contrary, one of the major founders of the black social gospel was almost completely forgotten. Ransom is ignored in most histories of American Christianity and the social gospel. And even most of the literature of the black church gives him very little notice. The activist organizations through which he made a public impact in his early career folded, or secularized, or let him down. The Socialist Party self-destructed in the 1920s and was culturally alien to him. He quit the Afro-American Council after it opted for Bookerism. He lost his place in the settlement movement after leaving Chicago, while Baptists took it over in black churches. The reincarnations of the old anti-slavery organizations faded away. The Niagara movement was too radical to be pragmatic, and too pragmatic for radicals like Turner. Thus it dissolved because Turner and Du Bois didn't get along. The NAACP grew out of the Niagara movement, but it marched through the courts, taking a mostly secular path. Ransom settled for survival work in the church, where a limited context and his increasingly nationalist rhetoric reinforced each other. His vision did not really diminish in his later years. Ransom wanted to build a cooperative commonwealth across racial and class lines, but the organizations for that did not exist, and the necessity of resisting the downward slide of unrelenting racial oppression prevailed in his daily choices. Up to 1912, he sustained some hope for national electoral politics. Afterward, he just shuddered and looked elsewhere. Woodrow Wilson was politically liberal, highly educated, and even ethically sensitive in a way. He represented the possibility of a new Democratic Party, one that was no longer a Southern regional party, but truly a national party. That's why Du Bois supported him in 1912. And upon entering the White House, Woodrow Wilson ramped up Jim Crow with, how to even say it? Ransom struggled for the appropriate word. Finally, he settled on fiendish. It repulsed him that Wilson's touted ethical bearing applied no brake whatsoever on his casual contempt for black Americans. A great deal of the story I have just told applies equally to Alexander Walters, Ida Wells Barnett, Adam Clayton Powell Sr., and several other founders who I write about in volume one, all of whom just refused to be denigrated. They applied the rhetoric of the old abolition to the new tyranny of Jim Crow, appealing always to the bedrock Christian doctrine that every human being bears the image and spirit of God. They taught that God favors the oppressed and excluded. They taught that thy kingdom come is the great and ignored center of Jesus' teaching, and that Christians are called to build up the kingdom of God. They preached about equality, democracy, peacemaking, and Jesus loving all the children. They puzzled that white Christians somehow just ignored the central gospel teachings. They proclaimed that missionary zeal is a measure of one's devotion to Christ and the good, and they called for a new age of the Spirit that unleashed the spiritual power of Christ-following idealism. Much of this theology was similar to the white social gospel and influenced by it. Ransom, Wright, Powell, Walters, and other founders were versed in white social gospel theology, and their successors, such as Mordecai Johnson, Benjamin Mays, J. Pius Barber, and others, were even more so. But the social gospel in black church context was profoundly distinct, socially, culturally, politically, and theologically, where, unlike in so many white social gospel contexts, laying down the cross of Jesus in black church contexts was simply not an option. Nearly every black American denomination featured the cross in its preaching, praying, testimony, and singing. The black social gospel would have gone nowhere without it, notwithstanding the problems of doing so. Ransom, Wright, Powell, Walters, and other founders often preached the cross of Jesus in the manner of modern theology, emphasizing moral and spiritual influence, where Jesus exemplified a religious ideal by suffering for others. Sometimes they used the language of ransom theory, where Jesus died to break the power of Satan over human destiny. Sometimes they vaguely employed satisfaction language about Jesus dying to appease the wrath of the Father or satisfy the demands of a divine moral order, but usually not as a doctrine that had to be believed literally. The founders shared the modern predisposition against magical thinking, and they recognized the pitfall of moral influence theory, that interpreting it as an ethical absolute underwrote, or could, an ethic of martyrdom that sanctified suffering. Black social gospel leaders inveighed against passivity and defeatism wherever they encountered it. They called Black Americans to rebel against the oppression and exclusion inflicted on them, usually avoiding any suggestion that the gospel inscribed an ethic of martyrdom. Holding fast to Jesus had nothing to do with accepting racial subjugation as God's will. This was a perilous endeavor on every level, for every atonement theory is shot through with the idea of redemptive suffering. And the atonement theory usually favored by progressives, the moral influence one, actually heightens the problem of sacrificial appropriation. We are indebted to womanist theologians, especially Dolores Williams, Emily Downs, Joanne Darrell, and Barbara Holmes, for pressing this point. All atonement doctrines, the doctrines themselves, turn the gospel of Jesus into a rational concept that's explained by a theory of salvation via sacrifice. Moral influence theory perpetuates the logic of surrogate sacrifice and heightens its danger of masochistic appropriation. If Jesus exemplified a religious ideal by suffering and dying for others, the gospel becomes a message of self-sacrifice and love perfectionism. Every Black minister standing before a congregation, especially during the rage, the mania of lynching, had to feel the danger of the cross to the well-being of every listener. Powell Sr. felt it especially because he preached constantly about the meekness and self-sacrificial love of Jesus. Powell and Ransom had to trust that they would be heard in the way that they meant, not in the way of capitulation that it meant to others. Yet nothing came close to the cross of Jesus as a subject of Black church preaching and worship. Black churches reverberated with hymns, gospel songs, spirituals, prayers, testimonies, sermons about the crucifixion of Jesus and being with him at the cross. In the testimonies and in the theology and preaching of every Black social gospel thinker, Jesus was a friend of oppressed people who knew about their suffering. Jesus achieved salvation for the least of these through his solidarity with him, even unto death. Black American Christians, like Jesus, did not deserve to suffer. But keeping faith in Jesus was the one thing that Black Americans possessed that white America could not control or take from them. For Black Christians, merely knowing that Jesus suffered as they did gave them faith that God was with them, even if they ended up, like Jesus, tortured to death on a tree. James Cone, in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, luminously explains, quote, "The more Black people struggled against white supremacy, the more they found in the cross the spiritual power to resist the violence they so often suffered. The crucifixion of Jesus placed God among the persecuted, tyrannized, tortured, crucified people. White communities lynched Black Americans in nearly every state of the USA, a ritual celebration of white supremacy suitable for family gatherings and picnics. Black Americans, like Jesus, were stripped, paraded, mocked, whipped, spat on, tortured to death. Just as Jesus was a victim of mob hysteria and imperial violence, Black Americans were victims of mob hysteria and white supremacy. Black Americans did not emphasize the cross because they enjoyed suffering or gloried in it or sanctified it. They sang of Jesus because he endured what they suffered. Womanist theologian Sean Copeland puts it exactly right. Quote, "The enslaved Africans sang because they saw on the rugged wooden planks one who had endured what was their daily portion. The cross was treasured because it enthroned the one who went all the way with them and for them. Unquote. The cross represented a victory over evil, the very powers of death. Ransom theory was powerfully true, with or without a doctrine about tricking Satan. Drawing upon Reinhold Niebuhr, Combe observes that it requires an ample imagination to see redemption in the cross, to discover life in death and hope in tragedy. The early social gospel ministers, especially Ransom and Powell, had the requisite imagination to see it and to refrain from trying to explain it in a theory. They let the spiritual power of the cross do its work without enveloping it in a required doctrine. Powell took this tack even in his revival sermons. In the early 1920s, as soon as the Gandhi movement emerged in India, Ransom and Powell began preaching sermons about Gandhi as the Christ figure of our time. They urged that Gandhi showed the spiritual power of revolutionary nonviolence and thus the paradoxical relevance of the way of the cross. Very few ministers anywhere dared to spell out the connection between the cross and the lynching tree, but Ransom was one of them. Lynching was not merely a national crime, he said, or an epidemic of mob violence, or even an alarming measure of racial antipathy. The plague of lynching said something profound about the kind of Christianity that existed in America and the kind of civilization that America was becoming.
That's right.
How it started, Ransom said, was no mystery. The former slaveholding states went on a lynching rampage to repress former slaves and their children. To justify their barbarities, the lynch mobs described black men as monsters that menaced the safety of white women. The lynch mobs and their allies in the press were so successful at stunting the conscience of the nation that a human being could be burned to death at the stake in Pennsylvania or Georgia without evoking a horrified reaction. Meanwhile, the churches did not acknowledge what lynching meant from a Christian perspective. Quote, "The pulpit should be the first to lead in an attempt to purge the nation of this foul blot, but the pulpit is mostly silent." Unquote. Ransom implored ministers to summon the courage to preach against lynching as an act of defiance against white supremacy. That was what it meant to gather at the cross in 1890 and 1900 and 1920 and through the Depression. What looked like submission was actually defiance. What looked like the triumph of evil was actually the means of its defeat. The paradox of the cross. By facing down the threat of being lynched and preaching about it, Ransom gave a witness to the terrible beauty of the cross and its way, paving the way to a black freedom movement that sought to break white supremacy in this country and the world. And that, friends, is the legacy of Reverend Ransom. Thank you.